Hello, and welcome to History at Bedtime. Cleopatra VII did not inherit a legend. She inherited a crisis. In 51 BCE, at the age of 18, she took the throne of Egypt, one of the oldest kingdoms in the world, but also one of the most vulnerable. The Nile still made the land rich. Alexandria still held the memory of Alexander, the authority of Greek scholarship, and the wealth of a Mediterranean capital. The temples still kept the rituals of the pharaohs alive. But outside Egypt, Rome was no longer a distant power watching from across the sea. Rome had become the force that decided the future of every kingdom around the Mediterranean. Cleopatra was born into that pressure. She was the last major ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek-speaking Macedonian house that had governed Egypt since the death of Alexander the Great. Her family had ruled for nearly 3 centuries, but by her lifetime the dynasty was weakened by debt, court violence, sibling rivalry, and dependence on Roman support. Egypt was wealthy enough to attract Rome's attention and too strategically important to be left alone. Its grain could feed armies and cities. Its treasury could pay soldiers. Its ports connected Africa, Asia, and Europe. Its independence was valuable precisely because powerful men wanted to end it. That is the real beginning of Cleopatra's story. Not perfume, seduction, or the later legend of a dangerous queen who ruined Roman men. The real story begins with a young ruler trying to hold together a kingdom that almost everyone stronger than her wanted to control. She became famous because of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, but she was not important only because Roman men desired her or feared her. She was important because she understood power. She understood language, ceremony, money, naval strength, dynastic legitimacy, Egyptian religion, Greek political culture, and Roman ambition. She knew how to appear as a pharaoh to Egyptian priests, as a Hellenistic monarch to the Greek elite of Alexandria, and as a necessary ally to the Roman commanders who needed Egypt's resources. The question is not whether Cleopatra was beautiful enough to change history. That is the wrong question, and it was always the wrong question. The better question is how a woman ruling a threatened kingdom survived 2 decades inside the collapse of the Roman Republic, negotiated with the most dangerous men of her century, and kept Egypt independent until the final victory of Octavian made independence impossible. Her life sits at the end of several worlds at once. The end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the end of pharaonic kingship as a living political institution, the end of the Roman Republic, and the beginning of the empire that would dominate the Mediterranean for centuries. To understand Cleopatra is not to retell a romance. It is to watch the ancient world change shape. This is the story of a ruler, a scholar, a strategist, a mother, a survivor, and finally the last pharaoh of Egypt. She was born in 69 BCE, the daughter of Ptolemy XII Elites, a nickname meaning the flute player, a ruler whose weakness and dependence on Roman support had destabilized Egypt in the years of her childhood. The Ptolemaic dynasty from which she came had governed Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, since the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE, when his general Ptolemy had established himself in Alexandria and founded a line of Greek-speaking Macedonian rulers who presented themselves publicly as pharaohs. Her family had ruled Egypt since before Rome was anything more than a city-state on the Tiber. But by Cleopatra's birth, that dynasty was visibly declining and Rome was visibly rising. And the question of how long Egypt could maintain its independence was one that every serious political observer in the Mediterranean world was asking. To understand the danger she inherited, it helps to see Egypt not as a romantic background, but as a state system of unusual depth. Egypt was not simply old. It was administratively old. For thousands of years, rulers had measured fields after the Nile flood, collected grain, maintained canals, supported temple estates, managed storage, and turned agricultural surplus into political power. The river made abundance possible, but abundance had to be organized. Without irrigation, surveying, taxation, scribes, transport boats, granaries, and local officials, the richness of the Nile Valley would not have become a kingdom. This made Egypt different from many of the smaller states around the eastern Mediterranean. It was not merely a court, a palace, or a royal family. It was a machine for turning the annual flood into food, money, soldiers, buildings, and legitimacy. A weak ruler could damage that machine. A foreign power could exploit it, but no one could ignore it. Rome did not want Egypt because of Cleopatra's legend. Rome wanted Egypt because Egypt fed cities, paid armies, and held a strategic position between the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, Africa, and the Near East. Cleopatra understood that. Her reign should not be imagined only as a series of meetings with Caesar and Antony, though those meetings were decisive. Between the famous scenes stood years of ordinary power: tax collection, grain shipments, priestly negotiations, debt management, court appointments, legal petitions, currency control, and the constant monitoring of Roman politics. She had to be theatrical because monarchy required theater, but she also had to be administrative because Egypt could not survive on spectacle alone. The Nile gave her a country. Alexandria gave her a stage. Rome gave her a danger. Her task was to use the first two against the third. The family she was born into was not warm. The Ptolemaic dynasty had a particular tradition of familial violence. Siblings married each other, plotted against each other, and killed each other with a frequency that makes the Ptolemaic succession lists look like casualty reports. Her father had survived his own siblings' attempts to displace him and had consolidated power partly through Roman backing, which he purchased at enormous cost to the Egyptian treasury. He was not a beloved ruler. There were revolts during his reign, periods of exile, and a general atmosphere of political instability that Cleopatra grew up in and that shaped her understanding of how fragile power was and how vigilantly it had to be guarded. What made her different from the pattern of her dynasty was her decision to engage with Egypt in a way that her predecessors had largely avoided. She was the first ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty to learn Egyptian. Her predecessors, including her father, had governed the most ancient civilization in the world for nearly 3 centuries without speaking its language, conducting all official business in Greek, leaving the native Egyptian population to be administered through intermediaries. This was not simply a practical failure. It was a political one, a statement of distance from the people being governed that generated the resentments which had fueled periodic revolts against Ptolemaic rule. Cleopatra learned Egyptian. She also learned the languages of the other peoples Egypt traded and negotiated with: Ethiopian, Aramaic, Hebrew, the language of the Arabs of the region, Parthian, the languages of the Medes, and of Troglodytae. The ancient sources that describe this facility are specific and consistent, and there is no reason to doubt it. Language was not simply a cultural interest for her. It was a political tool, a way of projecting herself as something her predecessors had not been, a ruler who could speak to her own people in their own tongue, who could conduct diplomatic negotiations without translators who might shade meaning or betray confidences, who could read the religious texts of different traditions and engage with their priests and practitioners directly. This matters because legitimacy in Egypt had always been layered. A ruler needed soldiers, but soldiers were not enough. A ruler needed the cooperation of Greek officials in Alexandria, but Alexandria was not all of Egypt. A ruler needed the priesthood, because temples were not only religious institutions, but economic and cultural institutions with land, labor, records, and local influence. A ruler needed the countryside, because the countryside produced the grain. A ruler needed the capital, because the capital connected the kingdom to the Mediterranean. Cleopatra's political intelligence lay partly in understanding that she could not rule these worlds with one identity only. To Romans, she could be the queen of Egypt, a diplomatic partner whose ships and treasure mattered. To Greeks in Alexandria, she could be a Hellenistic monarch in the line of Alexander and Ptolemy. To Egyptian priests, she could be a pharaoh, the living guarantor of divine order, shown in temple reliefs according to conventions older than Greek rule itself. To merchants, she could be the guardian of contracts and ports. To the army, she could be the source of pay. To her children, she could be the founder of a dynasty that might still survive if Rome fractured in the right way. This ability to occupy several political languages at once was not superficial. It was survival. Cleopatra ruled a country where a single identity would have been too narrow. Her genius was not that she escaped contradiction. Her genius was that she used contradiction as a form of power. She was also, if the ancient sources are trusted, deeply interested in the religious life of Egypt. She participated in Egyptian religious ceremonies, was recognized by the priests as a legitimate pharaoh in the Egyptian tradition, and was depicted in temple carvings in the traditional Egyptian manner, as a goddess, as Isis, as the divine queen who was the human expression of the eternal divine feminine that Egyptian theology had developed over 3 millennia. This was partly politics. Legitimacy in Egypt required religious legitimacy, and being recognized by the priesthood was essential. But it may also have been something more. She grew up in Alexandria, in a city that was simultaneously the most Greek and the most cosmopolitan place in the Mediterranean world, and the intellectual curiosity that city produced in its best inhabitants appears to have been genuine in her case. Her father Ptolemy XII died in 51 BCE, and she came to the throne jointly with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, who was approximately 10 years old at the time. The tradition of joint rule between a sister and a brother, and the sibling marriage that typically accompanied it, was standard Ptolemaic practice designed to prevent disputed succession and maintain the dynastic line within the family. In practice, joint rule between a capable adult sister and a young brother manipulated by ambitious regents created the conditions for the conflict that followed almost immediately. Within 3 years of taking the throne, Cleopatra had been pushed out of it. Her brother's advisors, a group that included a eunuch named Pothinus, a general named Achilles, and a rhetorician named Theodotus, had effectively taken control of the young pharaoh and used his name to drive Cleopatra from power. She retreated to the eastern edge of Egypt, near the Syrian border, and began assembling an army. She was 21 years old and in exile, and Rome was about to arrive on her doorstep. The arrival of Julius Caesar in Alexandria in 48 BC was the consequence of events in Roman politics that had nothing directly to do with Egypt. Caesar and Pompey, the 2 most powerful men in the Roman world, had been moving toward open conflict for years. In 49 BCE, Caesar crossed the Rubicon and civil war began. In 48 BCE, at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece, Caesar defeated Pompey's forces. Pompey fled east, heading toward Egypt, where he had connections from the earlier period when Rome had supported Ptolemy XII. He reached Egypt and was murdered on the beach as he stepped from his boat, killed on the orders of the young pharaoh's advisors, who apparently thought that presenting Caesar with his rival's head would earn Roman gratitude. The head was presented to Caesar when he landed. He wept, or claimed to weep. He was not grateful. The murder of a Roman consul and proconsul, however one felt about Pompey personally, was an affront to Roman dignity that could not simply be received with thanks. Caesar in Alexandria was Caesar at an odd moment of his career, at the peak of his power, but also at a point of unusual personal openness, curious about the world he was moving through, interested in the ancient civilization whose capital he was visiting. He was 52 years old, Cleopatra was 21, and the meeting between them, however it happened, was one of the most consequential encounters in the history of the ancient world. The story of how they met has been shaped by literary tradition into something romantic and theatrical. The image of Cleopatra rolled in a carpet, smuggled into Caesar's presence to avoid her brother's guards, delivered to the Roman general as a gift of dramatic audacity. This story appears in Plutarch's account, written more than a century after the event, and it may or may not be literally true. What is certain is that Cleopatra managed to meet Caesar despite being the rival claimant to the throne of the country he was in, that the meeting worked in her favor, and that Caesar, after weighing the situation, decided to support her against her brother. The reasons for Caesar's decision were not primarily personal. He was in Egypt ostensibly to collect a debt, the money that Egypt owed Rome for the military support provided to Ptolemy XII, and he needed political stability in Egypt to collect it and to proceed with his larger campaigns. A weak young king manipulated by ambitious advisors was a less stable arrangement than a capable adult ruler who had demonstrated that she could hold power. The advisors who had murdered Pompey were also, by Roman standards, criminals who had committed an act requiring Roman response. The political calculation pointed toward Cleopatra. The personal chemistry between them, of which the ancient sources make much and which cannot be entirely discounted, probably reinforced a decision that had strategic logic behind it. What followed was a military confrontation in Alexandria between Caesar's forces and those of Ptolemy XIII, the Alexandrian War, which lasted from late 48 into 47 BCE, and which was fought partly in the streets of the city and partly in its harbor. It was during this conflict that fire spread to parts of the harbor and destroyed an unknown portion of the Great Library of Alexandria, an event that has become one of the most mourned losses in the history of human knowledge, though the full truth of what was lost, and when, and how, is more complicated than the simple story of a single catastrophic fire allows. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile during the fighting, attempting to flee. His sister Arsinoe, who had supported him against Cleopatra, was captured and eventually sent to Rome, where she would later be displayed in Caesar's triumph. Caesar spent several months in Egypt after the conclusion of the war, and the child Cleopatra bore in June of 47 BCE, she named Ptolemy Caesar. The ancient sources call him Caesarion, Little Caesar. Whether Caesar acknowledged paternity, and whether he intended the child as an heir, are questions that the ancient sources treat with some evasion and that later Roman politics made deeply sensitive. Caesar already had a wife in Rome and no acknowledged legitimate children. The question of Caesarian status was one that would shadow both his mother's life and his own until the very end. Caesar's arrival also forced Cleopatra to understand something that would define the rest of her life. Roman politics was personal, but it was never only personal. Roman commanders were men with appetites, ambitions, friendships, grudges, debts, ideals, and vanities. They could be charmed. They could be offended. They could admire courage and intelligence. But behind every private conversation stood armies, creditors, Senate factions, veterans waiting for land, and rivals waiting for weakness. Cleopatra's skill was that she did not treat Roman power as a single thing. She treated it as a set of human relationships inside an unstable political system. This is one reason the old legend of Cleopatra as merely seductive is so inadequate. Seduction, even if one grants it a role, explains almost nothing by itself. Caesar did not need to risk a war in Alexandria for a passing affair. Antony did not restructure Eastern policy for a woman who offered only pleasure. Octavian did not spend years constructing propaganda against someone who was merely decorative. These men responded to Cleopatra because she mattered politically. She controlled Egypt. She could supply grain, ships, gold, and legitimacy in the Eastern Mediterranean. She could also become a symbol around which Roman anxieties gathered, anxiety about monarchy, about the East, about luxury, about female power, and about the possibility that Rome itself could be ruled from somewhere other than Rome. Cleopatra understood that symbols could move armies almost as surely as orders could. Her public appearances were not accidents. Her costumes were arguments. Her titles were arguments. Her children's names were arguments. Her presence in Rome, her arrival at Tarsus, her identification with Isis, the donations of Alexandria. Each was a political statement made through spectacle because the ancient Mediterranean was a world in which power was seen as much as it was written. Caesar returned to Rome, leaving Egypt in Cleopatra's hands and taking Arsinoe with him for display in his triumph. Cleopatra would later come to Rome herself. Installed with Caesarion in one of Caesar's properties outside the city, received publicly, present in the capital as a guest of the most powerful man in the world. The Roman reaction to her presence was complex and revealing. She was simultaneously fascinating and threatening, a queen of ancient lineage, clearly capable and clearly important to Caesar, equally clearly foreign and in Roman terms morally problematic. The Roman aristocracy that gathered around Caesar for political reasons had to accept her presence without being able to fully make sense of what she represented. Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March in 44 BCE. The conspirators who killed him included men who genuinely believed they were saving the Republic, men who feared Caesar's growing power, and men whose personal rivalry with Caesar overcame whatever larger principles they might have claimed. Cleopatra was in Rome when it happened, and she left quickly, returning to Egypt. She had understood, with the instincts of someone who had grown up in a court where political violence was routine, that Rome without Caesar was an entirely different environment and one in which her own position was immediately vulnerable. Back in Egypt, she moved quickly to consolidate her position. Her brother Ptolemy XIV, who had been elevated to co-ruler after the death of their younger brother, died shortly after her return. The ancient sources note this with a vagueness that strongly implies her involvement. Caesarion was elevated to co-ruler in his place. She was 25, still building the political structure that would allow her to survive in the post-Caesar world, and sentiment was not a tool she could afford. The Roman world after Caesar's assassination descended rapidly into another round of civil war. The Senate, in the short term, tried to manage the vacuum. Caesar's chief lieutenant Mark Antony and Caesar's heir and adopted son Octavian, the young man who would eventually become Augustus, the first Roman emperor, began maneuvering against each other and against the conspirators. The conspirators, Brutus and Cassius, were defeated at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE. The victors, Antony and Octavian, divided the Roman world between them, Octavian taking the west, Antony taking the east. For Cleopatra, the division meant that the man responsible for the Eastern Mediterranean was Mark Antony, a man she had met briefly in Rome during Caesar's time, a man who was now the most powerful Roman official in her part of the world, and a man who needed to make decisions about Egypt's status and Egypt's future. The meeting between them, in 41 BCE at Tarsus in what is now southern Turkey, is one of the great set pieces of ancient history, described in Plutarch's account with a vivid literary imagination that captures something, at least, of its theatrical quality. Cleopatra arrived at Tarsus not as a suppliant or a prisoner, but as a queen, on a lavishly appointed barge, dressed as Aphrodite, surrounded by attendants costumed as Cupids and Graces. The staging was deliberate and sophisticated. She was making a political statement as well as a personal one. She was not coming to Rome. Rome, in the person of Mark Antony, was coming to her. She was presenting herself not simply as a client ruler seeking Roman indulgence, but as a monarch of equal standing, the representative of a civilization older and in some ways grander than the one she was negotiating with. Antony was charmed, or at least interested. He was also assessing a political situation. Egypt was the wealthiest province in the Eastern Mediterranean, the breadbasket that fed the Roman world, the source of gold and grain and papyrus that Rome needed. Cleopatra controlled it. She had resources that Antony needed for his planned campaigns in the east, particularly the planned campaign against Parthia that would have secured his military reputation and possibly given him the leverage to complete his rivalry with Octavian on favorable terms. The personal attraction and the political calculation were intertwined in the way they always are when powerful people meet in charged circumstances, and the ancient source's enthusiasm for the personal story should not obscure the political reality underneath it. What followed was an alliance, personal and political, impossible to fully separate, that lasted 11 years, until both of them were dead. They spent that first winter together in Alexandria, and the accounts of that winter describe a quality of deliberate pleasure-seeking that sat alongside genuine political calculation. The inimitable livers, they called their circle, a name that carried both the aristocratic Roman association of the liver with deep feeling and a certain ironic awareness of their own excess. Antony returned to Rome, where he married Octavian's sister Octavia in a political alliance that briefly stabilized the relationship between the two men. He and Cleopatra would not see each other again for approximately 3 years. During those years, Cleopatra was ruling Egypt, managing an enormous administrative apparatus, dealing with the ongoing challenge of maintaining Egyptian prosperity and stability, watching the Roman civil conflict from a distance, and assessing what it meant for her own position. She bore twins to Antony in 40 BCE, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, the sun and the moon, and a third child, Ptolemy Philadelphus, in 36 BCE. The births registered Antony's ongoing relationship with her even during the period of his political marriage to Octavia, a fact that Octavian used systematically in the propaganda war he was beginning to wage. Antony's campaign against Parthia in 36 BCE was a military disaster. He had planned it as the great Eastern triumph that would solidify his position against Octavian, and it ended in retreat, significant casualties, and a diminishment of his military reputation that Octavian's propaganda exploited mercilessly. The failure increased his dependence on Cleopatra's resources, Egyptian grain, Egyptian gold, Egyptian ships, and increased the intensity of their political partnership. In 34 BCE, at a ceremony in Alexandria called the Donations of Alexandria, Antony distributed kingdoms among Cleopatra and her children in a manner that Octavian presented to the Roman Senate and Roman public as evidence that Antony had gone native, that he was planning a succession structure based in Alexandria rather than Rome, that he had abandoned his Roman identity for a foreign queen. The donations were the political turning point. Antony gave Cleopatra the title Queen of Kings. He gave Caesarion the title King of Kings and acknowledged him as Caesar's legitimate son, a direct challenge to Octavian, whose entire political authority rested on being Caesar's heir. He gave Alexander Helios the kingdoms of Armenia and Media. He gave Cleopatra Selene Cyrenaica and Libya. He gave Ptolemy Philadelphus Syria and Cilicia. These were the territories of a proposed Eastern Empire, a Hellenistic rival to Rome, organized around the Ptolemaic dynasty and backed by Roman military power in the person of Antony. Whether this was a genuine plan for an alternative empire or a piece of political theater designed to strengthen Antony's position in the East while he negotiated with Octavian is debated by historians. What is not debated is the effect it had on Roman opinion. Octavian was a master of political messaging, and the donations gave him exactly what he needed. He presented Antony not as a Roman general with a foreign ally, but as a man who had chosen foreign over Roman, who had abandoned his Roman wife for an Eastern queen, who was planning to transfer the center of Roman power to Alexandria. Roman identity, Roman dignity, Roman tradition, all of these were being betrayed, Octavian argued, by the man who was supposed to be Rome's champion in the East. Octavian's greatest weapon against Cleopatra was not his navy at first. It was language. He won the war of interpretation before he won the war at sea. Antony could be presented as a Roman who had lost himself. Cleopatra could be presented as the foreign queen who had taken him. Egypt could be presented as a threat to Rome rather than as the ally of one Roman faction against another. This mattered because Romans were deeply suspicious of kingship. They had expelled their own kings centuries earlier, and the word king remained politically toxic. Octavian could not simply say that he wanted to defeat Antony because Antony stood in his way. He had to say that Antony had become the servant of a queen. That framing allowed a civil war to be disguised as a foreign war. Roman soldiers who might hesitate to fight another Roman could be told they were defending Rome against Egypt. Roman aristocrats who feared Octavian's own ambition could be encouraged to look at Antony's supposed betrayal instead. The moral story was simple, memorable, and false in the useful way propaganda often is. Rome was discipline, Egypt was luxury. Rome was masculine, Egypt was feminine. Rome was liberty, Egypt was monarchy. Antony had chosen the wrong side of each contrast. Cleopatra could not fully answer this propaganda inside Rome because she did not control the Roman public sphere. She could negotiate with Roman leaders. She could support Antony. She could send money and ships. But she could not speak directly to the Roman people in the way Octavian could. That imbalance was decisive. By the time the fleets met at Actium, Cleopatra had already been turned into a story Roman audiences were prepared to believe. The war that followed was not presented as a Roman civil war, which it essentially was, but as a war between Rome and Egypt, between Octavian representing Western Roman civilization and Cleopatra representing Oriental despotism. The framing was effective and almost entirely false. This was fundamentally a contest between two Roman power brokers, but effective political framing rarely requires accuracy, and Octavian was very good at it. The naval battle at Actium, off the western coast of Greece in September of 31 BCE, was the decisive military engagement. The actual events of the battle are described by ancient sources in ways that are inconsistent with each other and that have been extensively debated by historians. What is clear is that the combined fleet of Antony and Cleopatra failed to defeat Octavian's fleet, that at some point Cleopatra's squadron broke away and sailed south, and that Antony followed her, abandoning the remainder of his forces. The abandonment effectively ended the war. The land forces that had been waiting in Greece defected to Octavian, and the cause of Antony and Cleopatra became militarily hopeless. Why Cleopatra left the battle when she did, and why Antony followed, are questions that the ancient sources answer in ways that reflect their political biases. The Roman sources, all of which were written from a perspective favorable to Octavian, present Cleopatra's departure as cowardice or treachery, and Antony's follow as evidence of his complete subjection to her influence. A more careful reading suggests that Cleopatra may have recognized, earlier than Antony, that the battle was lost and that preserving her fleet was the priority, that the ships were her last significant military asset, and that losing them in a battle that was already decided against her served no strategic purpose. Whether or not this is the right interpretation, she was not simply fleeing. She was trying to salvage something from a military disaster. What she was trying to salvage was Egypt itself, and the possibility of negotiations that might allow Egypt to survive under her rule, or at least under her children's rule, in some form that Octavian could accept. The months between Actium in September of 31 BCE and Octavian's arrival in Alexandria in August of 30 BCE were months of intense and ultimately futile diplomacy. She had agents negotiating with Octavian. Antony was separately trying to reach some accommodation. Octavian was willing to negotiate in order to buy time. He needed Cleopatra to remain in Egypt, with her treasury intact, rather than burning everything or fleeing east beyond his reach. but he was not willing to offer anything substantial. The situation in Alexandria during those months was extraordinary. Antony and Cleopatra, facing the end of everything they had built, appear from the ancient accounts to have faced it with a combination of genuine personal feeling and very conscious theatrical self-presentation. They renamed their society of inimitable livers the Society of Those Who Die Together. They made plans. They built elaborate tombs. They entertained lavishly. Whether this was denial, defiance, or a form of emotional preparation for what was coming is impossible to know with certainty, but it was not simple despair. Antony died first. When Octavian's forces entered Alexandria in August of 30 BCE, Antony received false information that Cleopatra was already dead. He fell on his sword, the Roman form of suicide for a defeated soldier, and was carried to the mausoleum where Cleopatra had taken refuge with her treasures. He died in her arms, or so Plutarch describes, after asking for wine and urging her not to grieve too much at what had happened to him, pointing out that he had lived a great life and died as a Roman, not ingloriously, but as a defeated man dying at the hand of another Roman. Cleopatra survived his death by a few days. Octavian had her in custody, whether she was technically a prisoner or under some more nominal form of Roman supervision, and she understood what being in Octavian's custody meant. She had been in Rome before. She knew how Roman triumphs worked. She had watched her sister Arsinoe displayed in Caesar's triumph 20 years earlier. The prospect of being displayed in Octavian's triumph, of being led through Rome in chains for the Roman crowd to see and mock, was one that she found intolerable, and the ancient sources present her decision to die as partly a decision to deny Octavian that particular victory. How she died is the most famous and most debated question in her biography. The story of the asp, the Egyptian cobra, smuggled in a basket of figs applied to her arm or her breast, its bite causing a quick and relatively painless death, comes primarily from Plutarch and has become the canonical account. But Plutarch himself acknowledges uncertainty, noting that no one actually saw how she died, and that the truth was not known. The asp story has a symbolic appropriateness that may have contributed to its adoption. The cobra was a royal Egyptian symbol, worn on the headdresses of pharaohs, the uraeus that represented divine and royal power. To die by the cobra was to die as a pharaoh. Whether or not the literal story is true, it expressed something true about who she was choosing to be in her death. Octavian found her dead when he came to her, or was brought to her by her attendants. 2 of her women had died with her, or nearly so. The account in Plutarch suggests that he was visibly moved, or at least performed being visibly moved, by what he found. He gave her burial honors beside Antony, as she had reportedly requested. Caesar Ion, her son by Caesar and the last possible heir of the Ptolemaic line, was found and killed. Octavian's reasoning, attributed to one of his advisors, was that too many Caesars was not a good thing. Her children by Antony were paraded in Octavian's triumph in Rome, including 3-year-old Ptolemy Philadelphus and the twins, who were 10, and then raised by Antony's Roman wife Octavia, who apparently treated them with genuine care. Cleopatra Selene eventually married the king of Mauritania in North Africa and had children, so it is possible that descendants of Cleopatra survived through her line, though tracing that lineage precisely across 2,000 years is difficult. Egypt became a Roman province. Octavian administered it with particular care, as the most important single province in the empire, the source of the grain that fed Rome, the producer of the papyrus on which the empire wrote, the repository of the wealth that would fund the long peace of the Augustan era. The Ptolemaic dynasty was over. The 3,000-year tradition of Egyptian independence, however battered and modified and transformed it had been across the centuries, was over. The world that had existed since before the pyramids were built had ended with the death of one woman. The reputation of Cleopatra in the centuries after her death was shaped almost entirely by the people who had defeated her or who had reasons to diminish her. The Roman sources, principally Plutarch, Cassius Dio, and various poets including Horace and Propertius, present her through the lens of Octavian's propaganda. She was the dangerous foreign woman who had seduced and destroyed 2 Roman generals. She was the embodiment of Oriental luxury and moral laxity. She was the enemy of Roman values and Roman self-discipline. These characterizations served the political purposes of the Augustan regime, which needed to justify what was essentially a Roman civil war as a war against a foreign threat, and which needed to diminish Antony by emphasizing his subjection to a woman. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, written in 1606, drew on Plutarch's account and gave the story its most influential literary form in the English tradition. Shakespeare's Cleopatra is one of the greatest female characters in the dramatic canon. Brilliant, mercurial, fully alive in a way that most dramatic heroines of the period are not. But Shakespeare was working within the Roman framework that presented the love of Antony and Cleopatra as the thing that destroyed them both, rather than as one element in a broader political story. The romantic frame, established in the ancient sources and powerfully developed by Shakespeare, has dominated the popular imagination ever since. The modern reassessment of Cleopatra has drawn on several developments in classical scholarship. First, a more careful reading of the ancient sources that takes into account their political contexts and limitations, recognizing that Plutarch was writing more than a century after the events, drawing on sources that were mostly favorable to Augustus, and that Cassius Dio was writing 2 centuries after the events. Second, the use of Egyptian sources, inscriptions, papyri, temple carvings, that give a different picture of how she presented herself to her own people and that confirm the specific claims about her linguistic abilities and her engagement with Egyptian religion. Third, a broader historical and archaeological understanding of the late Ptolemaic period that allows her story to be placed in its actual political context rather than in the simplified frame of Roman propaganda. What emerges from this reassessment is a figure of genuine political intelligence, operating in extraordinarily difficult circumstances with the tools available to her, making decisions that were sometimes successful and sometimes not, and ultimately failing to prevent the absorption of Egypt into Rome, which may have been impossible to prevent regardless of what she did. The resources of Rome in 31 BCE were simply too great for any single state in the eastern Mediterranean to resist. That she kept Egypt independent as long as she did, through the enormous turbulence of the late Roman Republic, is itself a political achievement that few rulers in her position could have matched. She understood Rome better than Rome understood Egypt. She understood Caesar and Antony as political actors with their own ambitions and their own weaknesses, and she used that understanding. She did not simply submit to them. The relationships she formed with them were genuine, probably, in their personal dimensions, but they were also the primary diplomatic tool available to her, and she used them as such. The charge that she used sexuality as a political weapon, implied in ancient and modern commentary alike, rests on an assumption that the relationships were primarily sexual in their political significance. What the evidence suggests is that the political alliances were primary and the personal relationships were inseparable from them. Not that she seduced her way to power, but that she negotiated it through the full range of means available to her, including the personal. She was interested in the world in ways that the sources occasionally let slip through the propaganda framework. She is credited in some ancient sources with writing works on chemistry and cosmetics, practical texts consistent with the intellectual atmosphere of Alexandria. She patronized scholars and was herself educated in philosophy, mathematics, and the natural sciences in the manner of an Alexandrian intellectual. The library that Caesar's war had partially damaged was still functioning during her reign, and the museum, the research institution attached to it, continued to be a center of serious scholarship. She lived in the most intellectually sophisticated city in the ancient world and was fully part of its intellectual culture. The gold coins issued during her reign show her face: aquiline nose, strong jaw, hair wound in a characteristic roll, and have been studied carefully by classical numismatists who are interested in what they tell us about how she chose to present herself. She is not conventionally beautiful in the modern sense, and the coins make no attempt to idealize her features in the way that much ancient portraiture idealized its subjects. She presented herself as a ruler, with the authority of her position expressed through the clarity of the image rather than through physical idealization. Whether this was a choice that expressed confidence or practicality, or both, it is telling. The famous line, attributed to various ancient sources, that it was not her beauty that captivated Caesar and Antony, but the irresistible charm of her presence, the quality of her conversation, her ability to engage any man in his own language and on his own terms, suggests something about what actually made her remarkable in the eyes of those who knew her. She was not, in the final analysis, a woman who relied on appearance. She relied on intelligence, on preparation, on the ability to read people and situations with accuracy and respond to them with precision. That intelligence did not save her. The forces arrayed against her in the end were too large: Rome's military dominance, Octavian's political skill, the structural reality of a world in which the Ptolemaic dynasty had been declining for a century, and in which Egypt's independence was increasingly untenable. But it allowed her to hold on longer than anyone else in her position would have, and it allowed her to go out on her own terms rather than Octavian's. She was 39 years old when she died. She had ruled Egypt for 21 years. She had been a player in the most consequential political drama of the ancient world. She had outlasted the men who had supported her, the men who had betrayed her, the men who had loved her, and the political system that had defined the world she was born into. She was the last pharaoh. After her, there were no more. The civilization she was the last heir of, the civilization of the Nile, of the pyramids and the temples and the hieroglyphs and the gods of Egypt, did not simply vanish with her. Egypt continued to exist under Roman rule, and then under Byzantine rule, and then under Arab rule, and its physical legacy is still there. The temples at Karnak and Luxor, the pyramids at Giza, the Valley of the Kings, the ancient reliefs carved into stone that the desert has preserved for 3,000 and 4,000 and 5,000 years. Tourists visit them in their millions. Scholars study them. The tradition of Egyptology that began with the decipherment of the Rosetta Stone continues to produce new understanding of the world she was born into. But the living tradition, the thing that was Egypt as a continuous political and cultural entity, governed by rulers who understood themselves as the heirs of the pharaohs, worshipped gods that had been worshipped since before writing existed, buried their dead with the expectation of resurrection in a form recognizably descended from the beliefs of the Old Kingdom. That tradition ended with her. She was its last embodiment, its last institutional expression, the last person who could stand in the tradition of the pharaohs and have that standing mean something politically real. The ancient world ended not with a single event, but with a series of them, spread across centuries. The death of Cleopatra in 30 BCE is one of the clearest of those endings. A moment when something that had existed for 3,000 years was definitively over, when the last person who embodied a continuity reaching back to the builders of the pyramids was gone, and a new world had fully begun. She deserved better than the legend made of her. She deserves, at minimum, to be understood on her own terms, as a ruler, as a politician, as a woman of genuine intellectual distinction, as someone who played an extraordinarily difficult hand with skill and nerve for 21 years, and who chose the manner of her death as carefully as she had chosen almost everything else. The Nile still runs north to the Mediterranean. The desert is still there on either side of it, pale and patient and enormous. The stars that were above Alexandria when she died are the same stars that are above you now. The same stars that were above the pyramids when they were built. The same stars that the astronomers of the Mouseion mapped and named in the centuries of Ptolemaic patronage. Egypt is permanent in a way that empires and dynasties are not. But she was remarkable, and she was real, and she was the last. The Alexandria that Cleopatra grew up in was unlike any other city in the ancient world, and understanding it is essential for understanding her. It had been founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE as a deliberate act of political vision, a new city on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt that would serve as the hinge between the Greek world and the world of the ancient East. In the 3 centuries between its founding and Cleopatra's birth, it had grown into something extraordinary, a metropolis of perhaps 500,000 people, organized on a grid plan with wide straight streets, divided into distinct ethnic quarters, the Greek quarter, the Jewish quarter, the Egyptian quarter, each with its own temples and its own internal governance, all of them subject to the authority of the Ptolemaic court. The intellectual life of Alexandria in the Ptolemaic period was the richest in the ancient world. The library, the great collection of scrolls that the Ptolemies had assembled through systematic acquisition and the compulsory copying of books arriving on ships in the harbor, was still functioning, though the precise scale of what it contained and what Caesar's war had destroyed remains a matter of scholarly debate. The museum, the research institution named after the muses that the library supported, continued to attract scholars from across the Mediterranean world, mathematicians and astronomers and physicians and geographers and literary critics, all working in an environment of extraordinary intellectual stimulation. Cleopatra was educated in this environment, and the education she received was one that no other woman in the ancient Mediterranean world could have matched. Greek mathematics, Greek philosophy, Greek literary criticism, Greek astronomy, and alongside these, Egyptian religious and magical texts, the records of the royal library that the Ptolemies had accumulated from Egyptian temple archives, the accumulated learning of a civilization that had been systematically recording knowledge for 3,000 years. If the ancient reports about her Egyptian learning are accepted, she could engage with a language and a sacred written culture that most of her dynasty had left to priests and scribes, and she lived in a court where demotic Egyptian documents in which Egyptian legal and commercial documents were recorded. This dual literacy, in both Greek and Egyptian, was itself an unusual achievement, and it connected her to 2 of the deepest streams of ancient knowledge simultaneously. The court in which she moved was cosmopolitan in ways that would have seemed impossible in any other Mediterranean city. The Ptolemaic court conducted its official business in Greek, but it was attended by people from across the eastern Mediterranean and beyond, by Egyptian priests who brought with them the accumulated theological and practical knowledge of the oldest religious tradition in the world, by Jewish scholars whose community in Alexandria was one of the largest outside Palestine and whose earlier generations had produced the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures known as the Septuagint, by merchants and diplomats and scholars from Arabia and Ethiopia and Parthia and India. The court was a crossroads, and growing up in it gave Cleopatra a cosmopolitan understanding of the world that almost no one else in the ancient Mediterranean could have matched. The Jewish community in Alexandria deserves particular mention because of its size, its influence, and its relationship to the Ptolemaic court. Estimates of the Jewish population of Alexandria in the 1st century BCE run into the hundreds of thousands. The community was wealthy, well-organized, had its own institutions and its own internal leadership, and had produced intellectual figures of considerable distinction. including, in the generation after Cleopatra, the philosopher Philo of Alexandria, whose attempt to synthesize Jewish theology with Greek philosophy. Especially the Platonic tradition was one of the most important intellectual achievements of the early Common Era. Cleopatra's relationship with the Jewish community in Alexandria was significant. The ancient sources record both her connections to individual Jewish figures and the complex political dynamics of governing a city in which Jews were a major population. The Egyptian priesthood was perhaps the most important domestic political constituency she had to manage. The priests controlled the temples, and the temples controlled the agricultural estates that generated a significant portion of Egyptian tax revenue. The relationship between the Ptolemaic rulers and the Egyptian priesthood had been, throughout the dynasty's history, a negotiated one. The rulers needed priestly recognition and priestly cooperation in managing the agricultural economy, and the priests needed royal patronage and royal protection for their temples and their extensive land holdings. Cleopatra worked this relationship with particular skill, participating in Egyptian religious ceremonies in ways that her predecessors had not, presenting herself in temple reliefs as a legitimate pharaoh in the Egyptian tradition, and earning the genuine support of the priesthood in a way that translated into real political stability in the Egyptian hinterland. The Great Temple at Dendera, where one of the most famous surviving reliefs of Cleopatra is carved into the external rear wall, was built during her reign and shows her in the company of Caesarion, both of them depicted in the traditional Egyptian manner as pharaonic figures performing religious rituals. The scale of the temple complex at Dendera, still standing today, one of the best preserved temples in Egypt, reflects the resources she invested in temple construction and the seriousness with which she maintained the religious obligations of the pharaonic role. The relief of Cleopatra at Dendera, carved in a style completely consistent with ancient Egyptian artistic conventions, shows not a Hellenistic queen, but an Egyptian goddess queen, and that is precisely how she chose to present herself to the people whose temples she was building. The currency she issued tells a complementary story. The Ptolemaic coinage was a closed system. Foreign coins were melted down and reminted in Ptolemaic denominations when they entered Egypt, a system that gave the crown control over the money supply and generated revenue through the seigniorage. The portraits on Ptolemaic coins are famously unflattering by the standards of idealized royal portraiture. The Ptolemaic tradition preferred realistic images that conveyed authority and individuality rather than idealized beauty. Cleopatra's coins follow this tradition, showing a face with distinctive features, a prominent nose, a strong chin, an expression of command that reads as authentic portraiture rather than idealization. The coin portraits are the only contemporary images of her that survive, and they are the primary evidence for what she actually looked like. The contrast between these coin portraits and the iconic image of Elizabeth Taylor playing Cleopatra in the 1963 film, widely considered the definitive visual representation of her for most people alive today, is almost total. The film, whatever its pleasures, shaped a popular image of Cleopatra as above all a woman of overwhelming physical beauty, and this image has been extraordinarily persistent. The scholarly consensus, based on the coin portraits and on the ancient textual sources that comment on her appearance, is considerably more ambiguous. Plutarch's famous account of her attributes, which is the primary ancient source for the not beautiful but irresistible tradition, was written more than a century after her death, and based on sources he does not specify. What is certain is that the ancient sources consistently emphasize her intelligence, her linguistic ability, and her force of personality rather than her physical appearance, and that this emphasis may tell us more about what actually made her remarkable than any amount of speculation about her face. The languages she spoke were political tools in a very specific sense. In a world where translation was the norm for diplomatic communication, The ability to speak directly to an interlocutor in his own language was a form of intimacy and a form of power. It eliminated the filter of the translator, who was always also a potential spy and a potential distorter of meaning. When she met with the ambassador of Parthia, speaking Parthian, when she conducted ceremonies in Egyptian, speaking to her priests in the language of the gods, when she negotiated in Aramaic with the merchants and officials of the Syrian and Palestinian territories that Egypt controlled. In each of these cases, she was communicating something beyond the content of her words, that she was fully present, fully engaged, not holding herself behind the barrier of a mediating language. The naval capacity that she contributed to the alliance with Antony was one of Egypt's most significant military assets. The Ptolemaic navy had been one of the great fleets of the Hellenistic world, and although it had declined somewhat from its peak by Cleopatra's time, Egypt still possessed the shipbuilding capacity, the timber resources, and the maritime expertise to project naval power across the eastern Mediterranean. The ships she provided Antony were a substantial portion of the combined fleet at Actium, and the question of what she intended to accomplish at Actium, whether she was planning from the outset to break away with her squadron if the battle went badly, preserving what she could for a subsequent negotiation, is one that the ancient sources do not answer honestly, because they were not inclined to give her credit for strategic thinking. The months before Actium were characterized by intense diplomatic activity on her part, as she attempted to find a settlement that would allow Egypt to survive regardless of how the conflict between Antony and Octavian resolved itself. She had agents negotiating with Octavian before the battle, and Octavian's strategy in those negotiations was to encourage her to believe that a favorable settlement was possible while making no actual commitment to one. He was buying time and buying her cooperation in keeping the Egyptian fleet at Actium rather than withdrawing it or destroying it. Whether she was deceived by these negotiations or was conducting her own parallel strategy of keeping options open is not clear. Probably both things were true simultaneously. After Actium, in the months before Octavian's final arrival in Egypt, she explored the possibility of an entirely different escape route. She attempted to have her ships, or at least some of them, transported overland from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, where they could have taken her and her treasury beyond Octavian's reach, potentially to Arabia or India. The ships were dragged across the desert isthmus to the Red Sea coast. The Nabatean Arabs who controlled the territory through which the route ran burned them. Whether this was done on Roman orders or on the Nabateans' own initiative in response to what they perceived as the changing political winds is not clear. The burning of the ships closed the escape route and effectively sealed her fate. The treasure she kept in the mausoleum she had built in Alexandria, and the threat, explicit or implied, that she would burn it rather than let it fall into Roman hands, was her last significant bargaining chip, and she used it with considerable skill across the final months. Octavian needed that treasure intact. The wars of the previous decade had been enormously expensive, and Egyptian wealth was the resource that would allow him to pay his armies, consolidate his power, and begin the reconstruction of the Roman world under his authority. A burned Ptolemaic treasury would have been a serious blow. She held that threat over him throughout their negotiations, and he was careful, right up until the moment of her death, to keep her believing that a negotiated solution was possible while ensuring that she remained in Egypt rather than burning the treasure or fleeing. The relationship between Cleopatra and Octavia, Antony's Roman wife, Octavian's sister, is one of the more psychologically complex threads in the story. Octavia was by all accounts a woman of genuine dignity and genuine character, who managed the extremely difficult position of being the wife of a man who was publicly and persistently unfaithful with a foreign queen with considerable grace and equanimity. When Antony finally formally divorced her in 32 BCE, sending her and her children from his house in Rome, The sympathy of the Roman public was entirely with Octavia, and Octavian used this sympathy as another element in his propaganda campaign against Antony. After Antony's death, Octavia took in and raised Antony's children by Cleopatra, including Cleopatra Selene, a fact that tells us something about Octavia's character that reflects well on her regardless of how one assesses anyone else in the story. The question of what Cleopatra actually felt about Antony, whether the personal dimension of their relationship was genuine or primarily strategic, is one that cannot be fully answered because the sources that describe it were all working within a framework that had predetermined answers. The Roman sources present her as manipulative, his feelings as genuine, and the relationship as essentially his tragedy and her scheming. The more honest reading, given what we know about her general intelligence and strategic capacity, is probably that the relationship was both genuinely personal in its emotional reality and simultaneously inseparable from the political alliance that made it necessary. These two things are not as contradictory as they sometimes appear in the ancient sources. She made no attempt to escape after Antony's death. She had options. The mausoleum where she was staying was a secure structure. She had loyal attendants. She had the threat of the treasure fire as leverage. She could have held out longer. What the ancient sources describe suggests that she had already made her decision, and that the negotiations she was apparently still conducting with Octavian were primarily aimed at securing some measure of protection for her children rather than at her own survival. The account in Plutarch of Octavian's visit to her in the mausoleum shortly before her death is one of the most carefully written passages in the biographical tradition. She received him, or was received by him, depending on how you read the power dynamics of the scene, on a simple pallet, dressed in mourning, her attendants sitting nearby. She had prepared a list of her assets, her treasury inventories, and when a secretary challenged some of the figures as understated, she flew into a sudden passionate anger that Plutarch presents as revealing something genuine in her character, a flash of the real woman behind the controlled diplomatic surface. Octavian, according to the account, told her to be calm and that she would be treated well. She did not believe him. She was right not to. The detail about her having concealed a small knife under her clothing when she met Octavian, intending to kill herself then and there if it seemed the meeting was going badly, and being stopped by a guard who discovered it, appears in some ancient accounts and not in others. It may be true, or it may be a literary embellishment designed to emphasize her determination. Either way, it captures something accurate about the quality of her decision-making in those final days. She was not drifting toward death, but moving toward it deliberately, on a timeline and in a manner of her own choosing. She died on the 12th of August, 30 BCE. She had taken care of her appearance. The ancient sources note that Octavian found her properly dressed, arranged as a queen rather than as a woman who had given up. Whatever she actually used to die, the asp of tradition or some other poison obtained from a doctor or alchemist, as some ancient sources suggest, she had ensured that she would be found as she intended to be found. The staging of her death was as deliberate as the staging of her arrival at Tarsus 20 years earlier. She had always understood that how things appeared was as important as how they were, and she maintained that understanding to the end. Octavian could display her children in his triumph. He could display wax effigies of her, showing her at the moment of her death, which he apparently did. He could display the symbols of Egyptian royal power, the throne, the scepter, the regalia of the last Ptolemaic pharaoh. What he could not display was her. She had denied him that, and whatever else he took from her, he could not take that back. The 2,000 years of her posthumous existence, the legend, the literary representations, the paintings, the films, the novels, the operas, the ongoing popular fascination, reflect something real about her story. It is a story that contains the elements of genuinely great drama, a woman of extraordinary gifts in impossible circumstances, alliances that were both genuine and strategic, political creativity confronting structural limitations, and a death that was a final exercise of the kind of agency she had always tried to maintain. The specific texture of the legend, the romantic frame, the emphasis on sexuality and seduction, the diminishment of the political intelligence, reflects the biases of those who told it. But the underlying story, when those distortions are accounted for, is genuinely extraordinary. She was the last of something very old. She was also, in certain ways, recognizably modern. A woman operating in a world that did not make room for her abilities, using every tool available to her to maintain her position in her kingdom, and being finally defeated not by a failure of intelligence or will, but by the overwhelming structural forces of Roman power in the 1st century BCE. The night she died, the stars above Alexandria were the same stars that had been above Egypt since the Old Kingdom. The Nile was running north to the sea as it always had. The city around the mausoleum where she lay was the city she had grown up in, the most sophisticated city in the world, the city she had ruled for 21 years. And in the morning, when Octavian's people came and found her, the world that had existed since before the pyramids were built, the world of the pharaohs, the world of Maat and Osiris and the eternal Nile, was finally over. She did not get to see what came next. The Roman Empire, Christianity, Islam, the medieval caliphate, the Ottoman rule, the discovery of Egyptology, the tourists in their millions visiting the ruins of the world she was the last heir of. She did not get to see any of it. She got what she chose, to go out as she had lived, as a queen, on her own terms, in her own time, in her own way. That was not nothing. In the circumstances she was facing, it was almost everything. But her final act only makes full sense if we look more closely at the dynasty that produced her. The Ptolemaic dynasty that Cleopatra ended had been, in many ways, a dynasty of extraordinary women. The pattern was not consistent. There were Ptolemaic queens who were politically insignificant and Ptolemaic kings who were capable. But across the 3 centuries of the dynasty's rule, women of the royal house had repeatedly played decisive political roles in ways that were unusual in the ancient Mediterranean world. Berenice I, the wife of Ptolemy I, had significant political influence from the beginning. Arsinoe II, the sister wife of Ptolemy II, was co-ruler in a genuine sense, issuing coins with her own image, receiving divine honors that were elaborated across the subsequent history of the dynasty. Berenice II was deified in her own lifetime and became a significant cult figure. Cleopatra III was so powerful that her sons were effectively dependent on her support for their thrones. This tradition of active female royal power in the Ptolemaic dynasty was itself a product of the dynasty's Macedonian origins, encountering Egyptian religious tradition. In Egypt, the great goddess Isis, wife of Osiris, mother of Horus, sister and equal to the male divine in a way that Greek religion generally did not accommodate, provided a theological framework that could legitimate female royal power in ways that the Greek tradition found more difficult. The Ptolemaic queens who claimed identification with Isis were drawing on a theological tradition 3,000 years old, and that tradition gave their political authority a religious backing that was real within the Egyptian political culture. Cleopatra was the most complete expression of this tradition, the ruler who most fully inhabited both the Greek and the Egyptian dimensions of the Ptolemaic identity. She was Isis incarnate to her Egyptian subjects and a Hellenistic queen to her Greek ones, and she moved between these two presentations with an ease that reflected both her education and her genuine engagement with both cultural traditions. The temple reliefs that depict her in Egyptian style and the coins that depict her in Hellenistic style were not contradictory presentations. They were the two faces of a single complex political identity that the Ptolemaic tradition had developed across 3 centuries, and that she brought to its most complete expression. The specific religious dimensions of her Isis identification went beyond politics. In the years before Actium, Antony had presented himself as the new Dionysus, the Greek god of wine and ecstasy and transformation, whose cult had a significant following in the Eastern Mediterranean, while Cleopatra presented herself as Isis. The pairing was theologically significant. Dionysus and Isis were understood to be analogous divine figures, their myths running parallel in ways that Greek-Egyptian religious syncretism had been developing for generations. By presenting themselves as the divine couple, the embodiment of the two great gods of the eastern and western halves of the Mediterranean, they were making a claim to a kind of universal divine legitimacy that went beyond simple royal authority. This was also, of course, theologically provocative. The Romans were not comfortable with the idea of a living person claiming divine status, and the specific Isis-Dionysus pairing was associated with the kind of Oriental religious enthusiasm that Romans of the conservative tradition found threatening. The cult of Isis was enormously popular in Rome. It had spread throughout the Mediterranean world and was one of the fastest-growing religious movements of the 1st century BCE. But it was also periodically suppressed by Roman authorities who found its rituals and its theology alien and its emotional intensity potentially destabilizing. Octavian's propaganda drew on these anxieties, presenting Cleopatra's religious claims not as legitimate royal theology, but as dangerous foreign mysticism corrupting a good Roman soldier. The children she had by Antony, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and the younger Ptolemy Philadelphus, were named with deliberate symbolic intent. Alexander Helios was named after Alexander the Great and the sun. Cleopatra Selene combined her mother's name with the moon. Ptolemy Philadelphus repeated the name of the most celebrated of the early Ptolemaic kings, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who had built the library and established the dynasty's cultural prestige. The names were a program. They announced the vision of a dynasty that would unite the Greek, the Egyptian, and the cosmic, ruling over a kingdom as large as Alexander's and as old as the pharaohs. Whether the donations of Alexandria represented a genuine plan to create this dynasty or a piece of political theater has been debated by historians ever since. What is certain is that Octavian treated it as genuine, or chose to treat it as genuine, because doing so gave him better propaganda than dismissing it as theater would have. The Roman response to the donations, driven by Octavian's skilled management of public opinion, was to present the proposed Eastern Empire as an existential threat to Roman values and Roman domination. This framing, however inaccurate it was as a description of Antony's actual intentions and capabilities, was politically effective. The Sibylline Oracles, a collection of prophetic texts that circulated in the Eastern Mediterranean in the 1st century BCE and that were updated and added to in response to political events, contain passages that appear to reflect the hopes of people in the Eastern Mediterranean for a Ptolemaic-based counter-empire that would displace Roman domination. These passages, in which an Eastern queen is prophesied to bring down the Western power and establish a just universal rule, are sometimes read as reflecting Cleopatra's own propaganda, or the propaganda of her supporters, or the genuine hopes of populations that had experienced Roman power as exploitative and destabilizing. Whether or not she was directly connected to these texts, they show that the political project she represented had a broader constituency in the Eastern Mediterranean than the Roman sources, focused on her personal story, tend to acknowledge. The impact of her death on Egypt was not simply administrative, the replacement of a Ptolemaic ruler by a Roman governor. It was cultural and psychological in dimensions that are hard to fully measure but important to acknowledge. The temple-building program that the Ptolemies had maintained, and that she had continued with particular vigor, stopped. Roman governors did not build temples to Egyptian gods in the way that Egyptian pharaohs had. The elaborate mortuary cult system that had sustained Egyptian religious life for 3,000 years, the ongoing offerings, the priesthoods funded by the royal treasury, the maintenance of the divine order through daily ritual, continued in modified form, but without the royal backing that had given it its fullest expression. The relationship between the divine and the political that the pharaonic tradition had maintained since the Old Kingdom was broken in a fundamental way. Over the subsequent centuries, Egypt was transformed. The Egyptian language gradually gave way to Greek as the medium of educated discourse, and then Greek gave way to Coptic, a language derived from ancient Egyptian but written in an alphabet based on Greek. Egyptian religious practice gradually gave way to Christianity, which spread through Egypt remarkably quickly in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era. The ancient temple cult system, the worship of Isis and Osiris and Horus and Ammonius and the other gods of the Egyptian pantheon, survived in diminishing form until the late 4th and early 5th centuries, when Christian imperial authority finally suppressed it. The last dated inscription in the Egyptian hieroglyphic script comes from 394 CE, 4 centuries after Cleopatra's death, evidence that the ancient writing system survived, in specialized religious contexts, for a remarkably long time after the civilization that had produced it had ceased to be politically sovereign. But the deeper cultural continuities were real. The Egyptian Christianity that developed, Coptic Christianity, the tradition of the Coptic Orthodox Church that continues today, incorporated elements of Egyptian religious sensibility that had no direct Greek or Jewish origin. The veneration of Mary as the Mother of God, which became central to Christian piety in Egypt at a remarkably early date, drew on traditions of goddess veneration, particularly of Isis as the Divine Mother, that had been fundamental to Egyptian religious life for 3,000 years. The images of the nursing Isis, holding the infant Horus, that had been carved and painted in Egyptian temples for millennia, provided a visual template that the Christian tradition adapted for images of the Madonna and Child. The connection is not a simple matter of direct borrowing, but the resonance is real and has been noted by scholars of both traditions. Isis herself survived the Ptolemaic period and the Roman conquest more successfully than any of the other Egyptian gods. The cult of Isis spread throughout the Roman Empire with extraordinary speed in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, reaching Rome, where it had significant followings despite periodic official suppression, and eventually spreading to Britain and the Rhine frontier. The appeal of Isis, a goddess who mourned her dead husband, who restored him to life, who protected her son, who offered her worshippers the promise of resurrection and eternal life, was evidently not limited by geography or ethnicity. She was among the Egyptian gods whose cults survived longest under Roman rule. Later Christian devotion to Mary developed within a very different theological world, but scholars have often noted the visual and emotional resonances between images of Isis with Horus and later images of the Madonna and Child. Cleopatra herself entered the tradition of Isis worship in a specific way. She had presented herself as Isis incarnate during her lifetime, and the women who worshipped Isis in the decades and centuries after her death were sometimes described as identifying the goddess with her royal exemplar. The boundaries between the historical Cleopatra and the divine Isis blurred in the popular religious imagination in ways that are difficult to trace precisely, but that appear in occasional literary references. She was not worshipped as a goddess herself in any organized way, but the identification she had claimed during her life persisted in the religious culture of her region long after her death. The ancient biographer Plutarch, who is the primary literary source for her story, wrote his Life of Antony, in which Cleopatra appears as a central character. as part of a project of paired Greek and Roman biographies designed to illuminate moral character through the comparison of historical examples. His framework was fundamentally moralizing. He was interested in the virtues and vices that historical figures exemplified, not in providing a politically neutral historical account. For Plutarch, the story of Antony was fundamentally a story about a great man brought low by a fatal weakness. His susceptibility to Cleopatra, and the narrative shape of his account reflects this moral framework throughout. This does not mean Plutarch was dishonest. He was generally careful about acknowledging his sources and noting uncertainty, and his account of Cleopatra contains passages of evident admiration alongside the framework of Roman moral judgment. His famous description of her as a woman whose irresistible quality lay not in her physical appearance, but in the pleasure of her company, the intelligence of her conversation, and the range of her personal engagement. This is genuinely admiring, and it comes from a source that had no particular reason to admire her. The admiration breaks through the moral framework, which is evidence that it reflects something real. The subsequent literary tradition drew on Plutarch and on the other ancient sources in ways that reflected the concerns of successive eras. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, as already noted, gave the story its most powerful English literary form. In the 18th century, she was refracted through the lens of Enlightenment debates about passion versus reason, East versus West. In the 19th century, she appeared in numerous works of art and literature as the ultimate exotic other, the embodiment of Oriental mystery and feminine power, a figure that allowed male artists to project their anxieties about female sexuality onto a safely distant historical canvas. In the 20th century, the film tradition, culminating in the 1963 Taylor Burton epic, gave the romantic and spectacular dimensions of the story their most global form. The scholarly reassessment of the late 20th and early 21st centuries has worked against this accumulation of projection and simplification. Classical scholars, Egyptologists, and historians working with the full range of ancient evidence, including Egyptian language sources and papyrological evidence that the literary tradition had largely ignored, have produced a picture of Cleopatra that is considerably more complex and more interesting than the legend. The woman who emerges from this scholarship is not the seductress of romantic tradition, but the politician and intellectual that the actual evidence describes. She was remarkable not because of what she looked like, but because of what she could do. And what she could do was exceptional by the standards of any era. The Ptolemaic dynasty she ended is itself, in retrospect, one of the more interesting political experiments in the ancient world, an attempt to govern the oldest civilization in existence using a Greek-speaking ruling class that gradually, imperfectly, and incompletely absorbed the Egyptian tradition it was presiding over. The absorption was always partial and always contested, and the tensions between the Greek and Egyptian dimensions of Ptolemaic identity, between the Hellenistic cosmopolitanism of Alexandria and the ancient Egyptian tradition of the Nile Valley, were never fully resolved. Cleopatra came closer than any of her predecessors to resolving them, by taking both dimensions seriously and embodying both in her own person. That the resolution came too late to save the dynasty does not diminish the quality of the attempt. She was 39 when she died. She had ruled for 21 years. She had been engaged, throughout those years, with the most consequential political events of her era, and she had engaged with them with intelligence, creativity, and courage. She had made mistakes, the expedition to Actium, the months of hesitation after it, but the mistakes need to be seen in the context of the options available to her, which were limited in ways that the historical record makes clear. What she built did not survive her. The dynasty ended. The independence ended. The living tradition of pharaonic rule ended. But what she demonstrated was possible, what she showed about the range of human capacity and political intelligence, that has not entirely ended, because the tradition of thinking seriously about her and telling her story has carried it forward across 2,000 years. She was the last pharaoh. She was also, in her specific combination of political intelligence, linguistic range, cultural breadth, and fierce determination to maintain her authority on her own terms, one of the most fully realized human beings of the ancient world. The Nile is still running. The desert is still there. The stars are still the same. But the political world she inhabited was made not only by Egypt. It was also made by the Roman men who encountered her and by the republic that was collapsing around them. The Roman men who encountered Cleopatra, Caesar, Antony, Octavian, each responded to her differently, and the differences are revealing. Caesar, the oldest and in many ways the most intellectually sophisticated of the three, appears to have been genuinely interested in her as a political actor. Their relationship was one between two people who understood power in similar ways, both pragmatic, both capable of strategic creativity, both aware of the theatrical dimensions of political authority. Caesar's decision to support her against her brother was not principally a romantic decision, and the months they spent in Egypt were as much about his genuine curiosity about Egyptian civilization as about personal attraction. He took time during those months that a man purely focused on his military and political agenda would not have taken, traveling up the Nile with her, visiting the great temples and the monuments of 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization. He was interested in what he was seeing, and she was his guide. Antony was more complex in his relationship to her, and more vulnerable. He was a man of great physical courage and considerable military talent, who was also genuinely susceptible to pleasure in ways that Caesar was not. The bond that formed between him and Cleopatra appears to have been real in a way that his ancient critics used against him, but that need not be understood entirely negatively. He was loyal to her across a decade of political alliance in circumstances where that loyalty repeatedly cost him, politically, militarily, in terms of his relationship with Rome. This loyalty was not simple weakness. It was a genuine commitment, whatever mixture of personal and political elements composed it. Octavian's relationship to her was entirely strategic, entirely adversarial, and entirely effective. He understood what she represented better than either of his predecessors had, not as an individual to be charmed or allied with, but as a political institution that needed to be absorbed or eliminated. The negotiations he conducted with her in the months after Actium were a performance, designed to keep her and her treasury in place until he could arrive in person. He was better at his kind of politics than she was, the cold, calculating, long-term management of perception and alliance that the Roman system increasingly rewarded. But he was operating in a world that was already organized in his favor, with the resources of the Roman state behind him, against a woman who was defending a kingdom on the losing side of a decided political conflict with the tools of personal authority and diplomatic skill alone. The world of the 1st century BC, it was changing in ways that made Cleopatra's position increasingly untenable regardless of individual skill or decisions. The Roman Republic was transforming into the Roman Empire, a process that involved the concentration of authority in fewer and fewer hands, the elimination of the competing power centers that the late Republican system had sustained, and the establishment of a Mediterranean-wide hegemony that left no room for genuinely independent client kingdoms of the kind that Egypt had been. The transformation was not inevitable in all its details. Different individuals in the key positions might have produced somewhat different outcomes, but the general direction was clear by the time Cleopatra came to the throne, and her entire political career was a struggle against that direction. What she managed to do, within those constraints, was considerable. She kept Egypt independent and functioning as a prosperous, administered, culturally active state, through 2 decades of Roman civil war that destroyed or absorbed most of the other independent powers in the Eastern Mediterranean. She managed the transition from Caesar's world to Antony's world without losing her position. She maintained the Egyptian economy and the Egyptian social fabric through periods of external pressure that would have destabilized less capable governance. She kept the Egyptian priesthood and the Egyptian population relatively quiescent through a combination of genuine engagement with Egyptian religious tradition and competent administration of the agricultural and commercial systems on which Egyptian prosperity depended. These achievements are not romantic. They are administrative and political, the kind of work that does not generate memorable literary scenes. But they are the substance of what governing actually requires, and they are underrepresented in the traditional accounts of her life, which focus on the dramatic meetings with Roman generals and the theatrical dimensions of her death. The years between the meetings, the decades of actual governance, are the foundation on which the dramatic episodes rested. The less dramatic parts of her reign may be the most important evidence of her competence. A kingdom does not remain independent for 21 years because a queen performs a few famous scenes well. It remains independent because grain moves, taxes are gathered, officials obey, courts function, priests cooperate, ports remain active, and the army is paid. Cleopatra's Egypt was under pressure from debt, Roman demands, dynastic conflict, harvest uncertainty, and the permanent instability of the late Republic. Yet the state did not collapse under her. It became, for Caesar and then Antony, a necessary partner rather than merely a prize waiting to be seized. The papyri from Ptolemaic Egypt rarely give us drama. They give us the texture of government. Receipts, petitions, contracts, exemptions, disputes, orders, inventories. This is precisely why they matter. They show that beneath the literary stories about royal passion and Roman civil war, Egypt remained a governed society. People appealed to officials. Land was measured. Debts were recorded. Taxes were collected. Priests negotiated privileges. Merchants moved goods. Soldiers expected pay. Cleopatra stood at the top of that system, and the fact that it continued to operate is part of her historical record. For an adult audience, this is where Cleopatra becomes more interesting than the myth. The myth asks whether she was irresistible. History asks how she governed. The administration of Ptolemaic Egypt was an enormous and complex undertaking. Egypt's agricultural economy was organized on the basis of the flood cycle, with the state maintaining the irrigation infrastructure, collecting taxes in kind from the agricultural surplus, redistributing grain and other products through a network of state warehouses and processing facilities, and managing the export of surplus grain and luxury goods to the Mediterranean market. The bureaucracy required to manage this system was substantial. Tax collectors, surveyors, warehouse managers, accountants, legal officials, postal administrators, all organized in a hierarchy that ran from the village level up to the nome administrator and ultimately to the royal court in Alexandria. Cleopatra worked within this system and maintained it with considerable effectiveness, if the papyrological evidence is any guide. The papyri that survive from her reign, tax receipts, legal contracts, administrative orders, show a functioning state apparatus operating with reasonable normality through periods that were politically turbulent. The one royal document that survives in her own hand, or something very close to it, is a papyrus order granting a tax exemption to a Roman citizen named Publius Canidius, who was one of Antony's generals. The Greek word at the bottom of the document, genestoi, meaning let it be so, may be in her own hand. If so, it is a remarkably prosaic remnant of one of the most dramatically represented figures in history, a tax exemption order, efficiently dispatched, moving through the administrative apparatus of the state she ran. The papyri that document daily life in Ptolemaic Egypt give a texture to the world she governed that the literary sources cannot provide. They show disputes between neighbors over water rights and inheritance. They show the contracts by which land was rented and goods were bought and sold. They show the petitions of ordinary people, men and women, Greek and Egyptian, wealthy and poor, who expected the state apparatus to respond to their grievances and who often received responses. This was the world she was responsible for, not the palaces and the drama of the Roman alliance, but the daily workings of a complex agricultural civilization that had been managing its own affairs for 3,000 years before she was born, and that continued, under Roman governance, for centuries after her death. The question of whether she had any children besides Caesarion before the twins she bore Antony in 40 BCE is not addressed in the ancient sources, and the silence is probably accurate. She was married, in the Ptolemaic tradition, first to one brother and then to another, but these were purely formal political arrangements with children for whom she showed no filial feeling whatsoever. Caesarion, by contrast, she clearly valued deeply. He was her son by Caesar, the child who represented the alliance that had restored her to power and who would have been the heir of both the Ptolemaic and the Caesarian traditions if the political dice had fallen differently. The fact that Octavian had him killed immediately after her death, she had tried to send him to safety in India through Ethiopia, but he was overtaken and killed, was not simply political calculation, however much political calculation it involved. It was also the elimination of her most personal legacy. The Antonian children she left behind had very different subsequent histories. Cleopatra Selene, the daughter, was married to Juba II of Mauritania, a client kingdom in what is now Morocco and western Algeria, and ruled beside him as queen for approximately 30 years. She named one of her sons Ptolemy, maintaining the dynastic name. She appears to have governed competently and to have patronized the arts and scholarship in ways that reflected her Alexandrian upbringing. She outlived her mother by nearly 4 decades, a queen in the Western Mediterranean rather than the Eastern, but a queen nonetheless. The male twins had less fortunate subsequent histories. Alexander Helios disappears from the record after Octavian's triumph, and the sources suggest he died young, possibly in Rome. The Egypt that Octavian took over was, despite the political disruption of the preceding decade, a functional state. He reorganized its administration, placing it under his own direct authority rather than under the Senate's, which reflected its strategic importance and his desire to control the grain supply personally. But the basic administrative apparatus that the Ptolemies had developed continued in modified form. He also made a point of visiting the great monuments of Egyptian history. He visited the tomb of Alexander in Alexandria and reportedly placed a gold crown on the mummy and scattered flowers on it. He was offered the opportunity to visit the sacred Apis bull at Memphis and declined, saying that he venerated gods, not cattle, a diplomatically blunt statement of the limits of Roman accommodation with Egyptian religious practice. His Egypt was different from Cleopatra's Egypt in ways that went beyond the change in who was nominally in charge. The patronage of Egyptian temple construction, which the Ptolemies had maintained and which had given the priesthood its reliable material basis, declined significantly under Roman rule, though it did not entirely stop. The Ptolemaic educational system, which had supported the Mouseion and the library and the scholars who sustained Alexandria's intellectual life, was no longer backed by the resources of an independent royal treasury. Alexandria remained the second city of the Roman Empire and continued to be an intellectual center of considerable importance, but the specific kind of royal patronage that had produced the library and the Mouseion was over. The library itself, whatever state it was in after the fires of the Alexandrian War, continued to function in some form under Roman patronage. Julius Caesar had apparently planned to rebuild or restore it, though the plan died with him. Mark Antony is said by some ancient sources to have given Cleopatra the contents of the library of Pergamon, approximately 200,000 scrolls, as a gift, though the historicity of this account is debated. The ancient sources that describe the library's destruction assign it to various causes at various times: Caesar's fire, later Roman attacks on Alexandria, the Arab conquest of 641 CE, and the truth is probably that it declined gradually through lack of funding and maintenance rather than perishing in a single catastrophic event. The last unambiguous reference to the museum as a functioning institution comes from the early 5th century CE, 400 years after Cleopatra's death. By that point, the intellectual atmosphere of Alexandria had been transformed by Christianity, and the pagan philosophical schools that had defined Alexandrian intellectual life were under increasing pressure from Christian authorities who found their teachings theologically incompatible with the dominant religion. The mathematician and philosopher Hypatia, who taught Neoplatonist philosophy in Alexandria in the early 5th century and was murdered by a Christian mob in 415 CE, is often taken as a symbol of the end of pagan classical learning in the city. The connection to Cleopatra is distant and indirect, but both women were remarkable intellects in a city that had produced remarkable intellects for centuries, and both met violent ends in circumstances that reflected the political turbulence of their times. The Alexandria of today, a Mediterranean city of several million people, built largely on top of the ancient city, with relatively little of the ancient urban fabric surviving above ground, has been the subject of systematic underwater archaeological investigation that has revealed significant portions of the ancient royal quarter beneath the waters of the eastern harbor. The sea level changes and subsidence that submerged these areas after the ancient period have preserved portions of the ancient city, foundations, statues, architectural fragments, even parts of what appear to be royal structures, that are now being mapped and studied by underwater archaeologists. Among the remains that have been identified are foundations that may belong to the Ptolemaic royal palace complex, the complex in which Cleopatra was born and lived and died. She has not been found. Her tomb, which Octavian honored with burial honors, has not been located despite extensive searching. The area of Alexandria where the ancient royal quarter was located is now partly underwater and partly built over by the modern city, and the specific location of the mausoleum she built for herself and in which she and Antony were buried is unknown. Various archaeological projects have proposed locations and have found suggestive evidence, but no confirmed identification has been made. She remains, in a literal physical sense, unfound, as she chose to remain, in the sense that mattered to her, beyond Octavian's final reach. The mausoleum he granted her burial honors and has not been opened. The tomb is still sealed, if it still exists and if it has not been disturbed in 2,000 years of building and rebuilding and flooding and subsidence in one of the most continuously inhabited cities in the ancient and modern world. Perhaps someday it will be found. Perhaps it will never be found. Either way, what she was is clear enough from the record she left, in the coins, in the temple reliefs, in the papyri, in the ancient sources that tried to diminish her and failed, in the tradition of her story that has persisted through 2,000 years of telling and retelling. She was remarkable. She was real. And the world she lived in and the decisions she made have left traces in the world we inhabit tonight, in the political traditions we have inherited, in the religious forms that carry something of what Egypt believed, in the simple fact that her story is still being told, still being argued about, still generating new understanding in each generation that encounters it. That endurance is its own kind of monument, more durable than the mausoleum that has been lost, more lasting than the dynasty that ended with her, more permanent than the empire that displaced her. The economic pressure behind her reign also deserves more attention because it explains why every Roman faction looked toward Egypt with such appetite. Egypt was not merely wealthy in a decorative sense. It was wealthy in the basic material sense that mattered most to ancient states. It produced food in enormous quantities. The Nile flood, when it came properly, renewed the soil with silt and made the valley one of the most productive agricultural regions in the Mediterranean world. Grain from Egypt could feed soldiers, urban populations, and political clients. Whoever controlled Egyptian grain controlled a weapon more reliable than rhetoric. This is why Octavian treated Egypt differently after he conquered it. He did not allow it to become an ordinary senatorial province governed by ambitious Roman nobles who might build their own power base there. He kept it under his direct personal authority, governed by a prefect of equestrian rank rather than a senator. No senator could enter Egypt without permission. The reason was simple. Egypt was too dangerous to leave in the hands of a rival. A Roman aristocrat with Egypt's grain, money, and ports behind him could become a threat to the emperor himself. Cleopatra had understood Egypt's value before Octavian took it. Octavian proved her understanding by the way he guarded it afterward. The grain ships that left Alexandria each year were therefore not just commercial vessels. They were the veins of imperial power. They connected the fertility of the Nile to the politics of Rome, the labor of Egyptian farmers to the loyalty of Roman crowds, the measured flood of an African river to the stability of a Mediterranean empire. Cleopatra's kingdom was old, but it was not irrelevant. It stood at the center of the practical economy of power. This also makes the charge that Cleopatra was simply a distraction in Roman politics especially misleading. She was not a distraction from power. She was power in another form. To ally with her was to gain access to the most valuable independent treasury and grain system in the Mediterranean. To defeat her was to claim that system for Rome. The struggle over Cleopatra was never separate from the struggle over the future of the Roman state. It was one of the places where that future was decided. The visual record of her reign also asks us to look carefully. The surviving coins do not show the fantasy face that later painters and filmmakers invented. They show a ruler who wanted to be recognized as a ruler. Strong profile, sharp features, royal diadem, controlled expression. Ancient coin portraits were not private photographs, of course. They were political objects, produced in quantity, handled by merchants and soldiers and tax collectors, carrying the ruler's image across the kingdom and beyond it. Every coin said, "This is the authority behind the transaction. This is the face of the state." In that sense, Cleopatra's coins are among the most honest evidence we possess. They do not flatter in the modern sense. They command. They ask to be read not as beauty, but as sovereignty. This matters because so much of the later tradition tried to move her away from sovereignty and back into ornament. The coin brings her back to politics. It says, before she was a legend, she was a monarch whose image guaranteed value. The same is true of the temple reliefs. They do not show the private woman of Roman imagination. They show the public pharaoh, performing ritual, standing before gods, participating in a visual language that had been used by Egyptian kings for millennia. To modernize these images can seem impersonal because Egyptian art deliberately subordinated individual likeness to sacred role. But that is precisely the point. In the temple, Cleopatra did not need to look like a person in the modern biographical sense. She needed to be the office she held. She needed to be the queen through whom divine order continued. Between coin and temple relief, we see the two political worlds she inhabited. On coins, she appears as a Hellenistic monarch in a Greek-speaking system of money, trade, and royal portraiture. On temple walls, she appears as an Egyptian pharaoh in a sacred system of ritual continuity. Neither image is false. Both are political truths. The Roman legend reduced her to the body of a woman. Her own images present her as the holder of institutions. This is why Cleopatra remains so difficult to simplify. She was not only Egyptian and not only Greek, not only a queen and not only a client of Rome, not only a mother and not only a diplomat, not only a survivor and not only a defeated ruler. She was a person standing at the crossing point of multiple traditions, each older than she was, and each demanding something different from her. Her intelligence lay in moving through those demands without allowing any single one of them to define her completely. Her defeat, then, was not the defeat of a personality type or a romantic excess. It was the defeat of one political world by another. The old Hellenistic kingdoms, with their dynastic marriages, royal cults, multilingual courts, temple patronage, and theatrical monarchy, were giving way to a Roman imperial order that preferred provinces, governors, legions, taxation schedules, and central command. Cleopatra tried to preserve the older world by mastering the new one. For 21 years, she came close enough that Rome had to take her seriously. That seriousness is perhaps the greatest answer to the legend. Octavian did not build an enormous propaganda campaign against a fool. Rome did not reorganize Egypt because of a love affair. Antony did not risk his position for a woman who mattered only in private. Cleopatra mattered because she governed something indispensable, because she represented a possible alternative center of power, and because she was capable enough to make that alternative seem real for a time. There is another reason her story endures. Cleopatra stands at a point where personal agency and historical structure meet with unusual clarity. She made choices. Some were brilliant. Some were risky. Some failed. But she was also moving inside forces larger than any individual could master. Rome was expanding. The Republic was dying. The Eastern Mediterranean was being reorganized around Roman military power. Egypt's wealth made it too valuable to remain independent forever. A different ruler might have lost Egypt earlier. A less capable ruler almost certainly would have. But even a ruler as capable as Cleopatra could not permanently reverse the direction of Roman history. This does not make her failure insignificant. It makes her effort more significant. She fought the future longer than most people could have. She used language, ceremony, alliance, motherhood, religion, finance, and diplomacy to keep open a political possibility that was narrowing every year. She tried to create a dynasty that could survive the Roman storm. She tried to make Caesarion more than a child with a dangerous name. She tried to turn Antony's eastern power into a structure that could balance Octavian's western power. She tried to preserve Egypt not as a museum of antiquity, but as a living kingdom. She lost, but the manner of the loss matters. She was not swept away passively. She did not disappear into Octavian's triumph. She denied him the living trophy he wanted, and by doing so she kept control of the last thing available to her, the meaning of her own end. Cleopatra's survival strategy also depended on one of the most overlooked features of power in the ancient world, time. A ruler often won not by solving a crisis permanently, but by delaying catastrophe long enough for the political situation around it to change. Cleopatra delayed. She delayed Rome's direct annexation of Egypt through Caesar's support. She delayed it again through Antony's alliance. She delayed it through negotiation, through the careful preservation of the treasury, through the management of priestly and administrative institutions, through the creation of heirs who might give Egypt a future after her own death. Delay was not weakness. In her situation, delay was statecraft. This is especially important because Egypt had already lost much of the freedom it once possessed before Cleopatra ever came to power. Her father had paid enormous sums to Roman politicians for recognition. Roman creditors had claims on Egyptian revenue. Roman commanders understood Egypt as a strategic resource. The kingdom was independent, but its independence was already conditional. Cleopatra did not begin from strength. She began from a weakened position and turned that weakened position into a diplomatic platform. Her tragedy was that she could make Egypt necessary to Rome, but she could not make Rome leave Egypt alone. The richer and better governed Egypt was, the more Rome wanted it. The more useful Cleopatra became as an ally, the more dangerous she became as an independent ruler. Her competence bought time and also increased the value of the prize she was trying to protect. The last queen of the ancient world, still here, in the only way that finally matters, in the persistence of her story in the memory of the world. We have followed Cleopatra from the court of her unstable father to the throne of Egypt, through the civil wars of Rome, through her alliances with the two most powerful men of the age, through the years of hope and the months of loss, and the final, deliberate act of a woman who refused to let her enemy determine the ending. She was not what the legend made her. She was something more interesting, a politician and a scholar and a linguist and a strategist, a woman who ruled one of the oldest civilizations on Earth through some of the most turbulent decades of the ancient world, and who remained herself until the end. The last pharaoh, the last queen of the ancient world, the end of something 3,000 years old. Sleep well. Good night.